Soup Princess. Long, long ago, in a kingdom far away, lived a beautiful princess, Effie, who lived with her widowed father, the king, in a palace on top of the hill. Effie was just as a princess should be: beautiful, clever, polite, a little smaller than most girls her age, and maybe just a little stubborn if she felt she wasn't getting what she wanted. And there was one thing she wanted more than anything in this world, more than her 5 white horses, more than her 20 silk dresses, even more than her 50 pairs of handmade shoes. Soup. The beautiful Princess Effie liked soup. No, she loved soup. Vegetable soup, meat soup, thin soup, thick soup, hot soup, cold soup, spicy soup, bland soup, green soup. Well, you get the idea. Now, no one really knows why Effie liked soup so much, but many say it was because of what happened to her when she was a little girl. Effie had sneaked out of the palace and was playing on a frozen lake nearby. As she played, she slipped and fell through some thin ice into freezing water. She would have drowned too if she hadn't been saved by 2 little boys who dragged her to safety. The 3 would have become great friends, but the boys began arguing, totally ignoring the shivering princess. And before the princess could thank them, she was rushed back to the palace and given a pot of soup to keep them warm. As she ate the soup, she thought of the 2 boys that had saved her and enjoyed the soup very much. Ever since that, she would have soup whenever she could. The years passed, and as it approached the princess's 21st birthday, the king's thoughts, as king's thoughts often do, turned to the marriage of his only daughter and finding a suitable prince for Effie. The king was a gentle and loving man, often skipping important state events in order to help Effie with her writing or hand-delivering some soup, whilst she painted her pictures of soup. When she wasn't eating soup, she was riding the horses around the estate. She loved everything in her life, but she found the suitors her father presented to her boring and uninteresting. She loved her father very much, but could not marry for his sake. She wanted someone special, and she could wait. Effie was very clever, and she had an idea. As she loved her father and knew how important this was to him, she agreed to marry on one condition. The man she would marry would have to be able to cook the best soup in the world. The king pondered over this for some time, scratching his long beard deep in thought. It was more difficult than the king had first thought. After all, Effie was rather an expert on the subject. The king looked over his glasses and his daughter and smiled. "Do you know," he said in his soft but deep voice, "I think that is a very good idea." The king set about telling the kingdom, delivering posters across the land, offering his daughter course, there was a great interest. The sales of cookery books shut up. Food shelves were bare, as would-be chefs tried hard to perfect the best soup in the world. Now, to a chef, this was a challenge, and especially to Barry George, who was one of the best chefs in the land, who, as it happened, lived in the local town. Barry was not an unattractive man, but he cared not to impress people through the way he looked. He wanted to be appreciated for the way he cooked. He had watched the trail of chefs, princes, and would-be kings march up the hills with hopes high, only to return a few minutes later with sad faces and empty bowls. Barry spent his time perfecting his soup. Years of practice and a good reputation made him the favorite in the race to make Effie his wife. Truth to be told, Barry had no interest in Effie. His dream was to be recognized as the best chef in the land, and this was his big chance. 3 weeks had passed, and the king was getting frustrated with the delay. He watched over Effie as every hopeful bowed gracefully, passed over a bowl of soup, and waited. They were often too excited to watch, as Effie always scoffed the lot. After all, she liked good soup and bad soup. The king, of course, would now straight away the outcome. Effie did not have to speak. She pushed the bowl away and wiped her mouth. She would screw up her nose like a mouse and say, "Thank you, that was nice, but I've tasted better." When it came to Barry's turn, there was a buzz that went around the palace. Crowds gathered and wished them well as he began the long walk up the hill to the palace. Those that didn't know him would have thought he was the strangest of characters, a scruffy-looking fellow, red-faced, huffing and puffing as he climbed, as it did, after all, take him longer than most. He soon began to regret the years of sampling his own cooking. He may have been scruffy, he may have been out of breath, but Barry was confident. The palace staff were confident. The king was confident. Even little Effie was expecting something good. Effie produced her special spoon and took a little soup of it and smelled it. She smiled. The king smiled. Barry nodded. She closed her eyes and took a sip. Lovely, she said. The king clapped. The servants in the palace cheered. But as the king went to shake Barry's hand, Effie interrupted him. "But," she said, "pause then quietly. There's something missing." Barry could not believe his ears. He became very red and very cross, very quickly, as chefs do. "Something missing," he shouted. He pushed away the platter and bowl and stumped out of the palace, barking all of the servants out of his way. The servants went back to their work. The king forced a smile, turned his back, and went up to bed. Only Effie remained at the table, trying to save the soup, which had been tipped on the table. After all, it was good soup. From outside the royal windows, a shadowy figure stared at the princess. disappeared, following the chef into the town. Barry was fuming. He didn't notice the servants he pushed out of the way, or the crowds waiting for him in the town, or the King Barry posters that had been put up outside his restaurant. He also didn't notice the shadowy figure following him down the dark alley behind the large kitchen of his restaurant. As he entered the kitchen through the back door, he sat down, collapsing against his pots and pans, his head in his hands. He must have fallen asleep, as he was suddenly startled by a noise in the yard. He jumped up with a start and crept towards the door with a wooden spoon and glass mixing bowl, ready to confront what he thought was a stray dog that was scrounging for tidbits thrown by the kitchen staff. He opened the back door and went into the yard. Nothing. As he re-entered the kitchen and closed the door behind him, he came face to face with the mysterious stranger. He dropped the bowl. Smash! Only it was no stranger to Barry George. This was Frank. Frank was Barry's brother. Their eyes met. Frank younger, slightly taller, and considerably slimmer than Barry was dressed in some smart, bright, foreign-looking clothes. Although he would never admit it, he was a handsome man and stood confidently in front of his elder brother. Barry and Frank were not best of the brothers. They had fought all their lives, each one believing that they were better than the other. They had the same interest, played the same sports, but never agreed on anything. Frank had left the town as soon as he was old enough to travel on his own. Frank, like Barry, was also a chef and had spent the last 5 years traveling the world, collecting spices and flavors from every country he visited, storing them in leather pouches hanging from his thick leather belt. Frank tried to explain how he had seen the posters and thought he would like to make a soup for the princess. He also explained how he watched from the window and saw the princess reject the soup. Barry could not listen anymore. He didn't want his brother teasing him about his soup. Frank went on to say how his heart leaped when he saw the princess, how beautiful Effie was, and how in love he had fallen. But Barry had disappeared upstairs before he could finish talking. Frank spent the night using the kitchen as bare foods to create his masterpiece. He wanted more than anything to impress Princess Effie. He took off his belt and used the spices in large quantities to give the soup a special zing. Unfortunately, he was not a great chef. In fact, he was quite terrible. But believing love will find a way, he marched up to the palace gates and knocked firmly on the palace door. It was so early, only the princess was awake and wandering the palace. When Effie opened the door, she instantly fell in love with Frank. She had never felt the same about anything before, apart from soup. She invited him and called to her father without taking her eyes off Frank. Now the king was unsure of him. He could see that her daughter was impressed by this man, but rules were rules. If he could not create the best soup in the world, he would not be allowed to marry Effie. As the table was prepared and the soup brought forward, he watched Effie like a hawk. If this wasn't a fantastic soup, he would tell. The soup was heated and brought to Effie. The princess smiled at Frank, and Frank smiled back, passing the bowl to her. She spoon and dipped it in the soup. She hoped more than anything that it would be the best soup. Then, just as she brought the spoon to her mouth, the palace door flung open. Wait, it was Barry. He had been listening to Frank the night before. He had used a touch of Frank's spices to his own recipe, and once tested, he had rushed to the palace just in time. "Frank," he said, "you have the wrong soup. This one is yours." Effie looked at the two brothers, and suddenly they both looked very familiar. These were the two boys that helped her out of the frozen lake all these years ago. Frank was so confused, but his brother was so insistent that the soup swap was made. The king, Effie, and all the servants believed him, and the exchange was made. Barry winked at Frank as he placed his soup on the table. The princess took the bowl and tried the soup. Her eyes opened wide, and she beamed as she said, "That's it, the world's best soup." The king looked closely and could tell his daughter was telling the truth. He couldn't believe it. "Congratulations, my son," he said, and put his arm around Frank. Frank took Effie in his arms and asked her to marry him. It didn't take long for an answer. Oh yes, and before the month was out, they were married. Frank never understood why Barry had come to his rescue. Perhaps he wanted to see his brother happy. Perhaps he wanted to prove that he could make the best soup in the world with the right ingredients. Whatever the reason, one thing is for sure. They all lived, as often they do in these stories, happily ever after. Now, if you like this story, please search in my channel for more videos. Click subscribe and like if you want to, and feel free to leave any story requests in the comments and I will take a look at it. I'll see you in my next video.